Tonight, the world says goodbye to yet another comedic legend, Joan Rivers. She has passed away at the age of 81. She created a wave of laughter around the globe and also broke a lot of boundaries for female comedians globally. Tonight, we take a look back at her life and long-standing career and hear from someone who knew her very well. And lawmakers under investigation, we don't have to look any further than our own backyard to find them, and many of them aren't letting indictments stand in the way of keeping their jobs. It's a good idea, and how does it sit with the public? Plus, political newcomers like Democratic gubernatorial hopeful Zephyr Teachout, they are green when it comes to politics, but she seems to certainly talk the talk here. The question is, especially after what we've seen with people who've come from the outside into politics, how much does experience really have value here when it comes to actually governing? We'll get into that conversation as well. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you for joining us. And tonight, the world and the comedic world is remembering Joan Rivers. Rivers, who was the first woman to host a late-night talk show. She opened doors across the entertainment industry and was considered a trailblazer for women in comedy. Rivers' daughter, Melissa, announced today that her mother died peacefully in New York. And as senior political correspondent Andrew Whitman has a look back at her life and her career. Andrew?
Joan. She was known as the queen of the barbed one-liners.
Funny about Dawn.
Joan Rivers brought her unique brand of controversial comedy to the world for nearly 50 years, and no one was safe from her zings.
First of all, that dress has more creases than my face did before Botox.
Rivers, who talked openly about numerous plastic surgeries, was born in 1933 in Brooklyn as Joan Alexandra Malinsky. Her New York accent and raspy voice becoming trademarks following her first big break as a stand-up comic in the 1960s. On The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson,
Right smack then and there. Changed my life.
From there, she went on to become the first woman to host her own late-night show.
I called Johnny and said, Johnny, I've got it. And he hung up on me. Never spoke to me again.
The Emmy-winning and Tony-nominated comedian hosted a daytime talk show. She wrote a dozen books and was the red carpet fashion critic.
Orange is the new.
She and her daughter Melissa often on camera together, including in their own reality TV show.
What did you do? Don't do that, Melissa.
Rivers joked openly about being a single mother after her husband killed himself in 1987.
I'm still not over his suicide. I'm still furious with him. Son of a. They say to me, oh, you'll go to heaven, you'll meet Edgar. I'll kill him.
Rivers, who found humor in her darkest moments and deepest insecurities,
So I'm making fun of everything. Just make fun of it and get on with it.
was 81 years old.
And we will talk about Joan Rivers now. In fact, we'll begin with someone who knew her quite well. Knew Joan Rivers personally, Michael Musto, both a friend and a follower of Miss Rivers, and writes a weekly comment on Out.com. And just recently wrote an article entitled The Joan Rivers I Know and Love. Michael, thank you. And in your piece, you talk about her as a person as much as a trailblazer. How do you remember Joan Rivers?
Well, she was a friend, and I'm not somebody who usually befriends celebrities, that's for sure, but we were kindred spirits. We're cut from the same cloth. She was somebody who lived to perform, to move, to be on the go. She never missed a performance. She always knew her lines and was always trying out new material. And she's somebody who was always trying to work out the newest way to offend people in a good way, to push their buttons in a way that kind of would advance society and yet appall people at the same time. But what people didn't realize is the person who did that kind of caustic, bitchy humor, Joan Rivers, was a doll. She was a living doll. She was so sweet, charming, professional, somebody who represented a kind of showbiz that's really not going to exist anymore.
Michael, for people who take it for granted, just give an idea of what it was like to be a female comic in the 70s, let alone the ground that she broke here, and actually was the first person who filled in for Johnny Carson, the only person, and the first female who actually hosted her own late-night comic show.
Well, comedy is a male-dominated field, and especially in the 50s when she got her start in these little New York nightclubs, you can imagine how hard it was for a woman to break in. To do so, you had to be extra acerbic and funny and witty. You also had to indulge in very bitchy comedy and also be self-mocking, sort of like a Phyllis Diller type. Joan Rivers indulged in that kind of self-deprecating humor, and that enabled her to lash out at other people with elan, and that's what she did. And then when she started substituting for Johnny Carson's show in the 80s, and every time he was sick or busy, it was a real event for all the hip New Yorkers who would tune in to see what Joan Rivers was going to say about Elizabeth Taylor and Princess Caroline. And then she inevitably got her own show because she was that electrifying on the small screen. And Johnny was angry. He felt betrayed. And in fact, Joan was banned by NBC until recently. It was a decades-long ban that really dogged her life. She had a lot of heartbreak. Her husband Edgar killed himself. He was also her business manager. That was not only devastating, it left her with a lot of debts. But she was somebody who never turned down an opportunity. She had 3 TV shows on at one time. She was always performing in clubs and performing in local places here in New York where she would work out new material and try new audiences. She was tireless, and her worst fear, as was shown in the documentary about her that came out a few years ago, was having downtime. She hated looking at her calendar and seeing an empty page. She always wanted to be performing and making people laugh.
You know, Michael, you put, and I thought it was a really nice piece you wrote today. Just share that anecdote, because she was good to you, too. I mean, she gave you access throughout her career, and even when you tried to give her a few, pay her actually for her travel expenses, tell everybody what she had to say.
Well, she co-hosted with the actor Michael Urie a splashy party for me for my 25th anniversary at a certain publication, and she did it for free. She did it just for sheer love of being a host at a party and because she believed in me. And at one point I handed her an envelope and I said, let me at least take care of your transportation for the night. And she handed it right back without missing a beat. She said, buy flowers for your mother. And I've been buying flowers for my mother ever since. And now I'm buying flowers for Joan. I cannot believe it's a world without Joan Rivers. It's just not right.
She didn't have any limits. I love that interview you shared in terms of talking about that she was living in the basement of her daughter's home, and somehow she worked Anne Frank and Chilean miners into it.
She worked those 2 things into most of her material, along with Helen Keller, and she had no limits. There's a scene in her documentary where she's telling stories about, I think, a kid with autism or something, making jokes about it, and a man in the audience is horrified, and he says, my son is autistic, how could you do this? And she said, I don't care. Humor is the great healer. Humor is how we get through the dark things, and that's why we have to laugh and make jokes now for Joan Rivers, because that's how she would have dealt with something this awful.
Well, Michael,
humor, she saw the cathartic, cleansing aspect of humor. That was her gift to the world.
Well, I certainly appreciate you sharing a few minutes with us talking about the Joan Rivers you knew. Michael Musto, thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
All right, I want to bring in our panel talking of Richard Brodsky, former Democratic New York State Assemblyman, a senior fellow at Demos, professor at NYU, and a full member of the media. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, and Andrew Whitman, senior political correspondent. And Andrew, you follow comics, and in fact, I didn't realize until today she appeared on Louis C.K.'s show, on Louis. And
like a couple of years ago.
And it was actually a serious turn, right?
It was an amazing episode. Louis got tired of performing at a casino in Atlantic City, and he sort of blew off his performance. And she scolded. She's like, this is what comics do. You don't like where you are today, but you'll be in the bigger room in another day. And they talked about the love of comedy in a very serious way. And then they slept together on the show. So it was just, I mean, she's anything for a laugh. And I remember late 70s, early 80s from the Tonight Show and stuff like that. And then I saw clips of her stand-up work, and I saw her in Atlantic City once. She was an amazing comic when it came to women's issues, and an amazing leap forward for female comics, but she was just an amazing comic. It was that underlying core of just anything for a laugh, whatever gets you to the laugh
They
fastest.
say you can tell a lot about comics at roasts, and whether she was being roasted or she was roasting others, somehow she ran the room, they say. It doesn't matter who was in the room, and they say even among comics you tend to see a lot. And Richard, people don't know, but she came from Larchmont. That was actually a part of her act, too.
She made it a big deal when she started out in the Sullivan Show. And so Larchmont and Suburban, I think that's part of the popularity she enjoyed, she's recognizable. She's a good comic in my judgment.
Yeah.
She said funny things, but she was a personality that we recognized. We had a neighbor or an aunt who ended up with too much plastic surgery and couldn't keep a lid on it and was funny and had that brassy voice. And it was that, I think she related to a constituency of people who not only enjoyed her one-liners, but enjoyed her persona. And I shared that.
You know, Dominic, for people, depending where your generation was, they thought, my God, Arsenio Hall, he broke barriers. And he did at the time when he had that show. But Joan Rivers, I was young, but I remember that if Carson wasn't there, it was Joan Rivers. And then when she got her own gig on Fox, that was huge news at the time, remember?
I remember it well. You know, Joan Rivers is someone that will be remembered, Richard, as someone that was very funny. Frankly, there are some comedians that I don't find very funny at all. What I'm impressed by is that she would push it. She would push the limit. That's what she did. If you had on a tacky dress, she would call it tacky and worse on television.
You had a tacky dress?
Yeah, I did. I did last night.
Strapless now, right?
Yeah, it was strapless. It was strapless. She and two other things I really appreciate about her. One, she reinvented herself so that she was relevant even today more than being the historic figure that she is. And what I appreciate about her is that she overcame adversity. Her second husband committing suicide. She's left with her daughter, and you wouldn't even know it based
Huge
on her
debts,
act.
too. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
It's always a fine line being mean for comic purposes. I mean, it's easy to do, but it's also really easy to go over the top and hurt people's feelings and lose the audience in the process. She was always able to be mean, but in a good-natured spirit. And
Because I think she took shots at herself, too.
She did.
Yeah.
She did. She would always take shots at herself, and that was something different. There weren't that many comics coming out of the 50s and 60s who would do that and could get away with it, and she did. And you know, she started by attacking herself, and eventually, God, I remember when she hosted Saturday Night Live in the early '80s, doing a sketch about Elizabeth Taylor, who was a frequent, and it was National Velvet. It was a repeat of National, and she said, like, we ate the horse or something like that. And I'd never seen National Velvet. I didn't get the joke. I went back and I watched the movie, and I laughed again. So.
Yeah, and for anybody who thinks of the Sandra Bernhards or even the Kathy Griffins, pale imitations, and there wouldn't be those folks here if she didn't do what she did, and a quintessential New Yorker, if nothing else. Okay. When we come back, everyone, we switch gears. It's political season here, and that in and of itself we talk about, but we're talking about certain folks in particular who got a lot hanging over them. I'm not just talking about bad poll numbers. They're not letting scandal get in the way of a campaign. You got 3 New York State senators seeking re-election despite being investigated for corruption as we speak. Should investigations alone be enough to get them at least facing uphill challenges to get re-elected, let alone out of the game? We'll be right back to talk about that and much more.